Now, PIIRS was established to serve as an interdisciplinary and interregional forum for discussion. We hope it would be a place where people with different lenses looking at different places might actually come together and talk and teach each other something. That partly accounts for the incredible hubris of actually calling a conference the state of the world. The state of the world, the way I see it, is we're never going to be able to give a definitive version of it. I mean, that's ridiculous. And in fact, what I said at the very beginning of the conference, which is if you're ever going to do a truly accurate state of the world, you would need a map the size of the same region you're mapping. So there's no way, but what I thought this would be a good place to start a dialogue about what really do we see as the state of the world? What are the big directions? We begin with the obvious question for the state of the world is, what is so different about the 21st century other than 9/11? We still don't know if that's going to be an epic phenomenon or really, in a sense, define the century. I think what is different is while the 20th century was also the height of the modern, it was also a time of linear or oppositional conflicts. Empire versus colony, Britain versus Germany, the Cold War, totalitarian systems versus democratic ones. Now, as complicated as these were, they tended to be, again, fairly linear and fairly straightforward. At the end of the 20th century, people saw the end of some of these struggles as leading to this grand Hegelian synthesis, the victory of the market and democracy. Instead, I think what has happened is the rise of new contradictions, which are much more complicated than the kinds of conflicts we had in the 20th century. For the first panel, which looks at the local and the global, what I asked them to do is really think about what kinds of authority structures there are in the world today, and are these pretty consistent, and can we expect to retain these authority structures for the next half century or so? That is, how are we giving orders, and what kinds of institutions exist to give orders, and are these the ones that we're going to see? Obviously, for both speakers, they spoke a great deal about the decline of the state. This is something that's been going on for quite a while. But that wasn't necessarily I could have easily seen two other panelists talking about that NGOs and corporations were really the sources of authority. That was a wide open one.
I'm Charles Maier. I'm a historian, primarily of Europe at Harvard University. I'm a contemporary historian, which means I choose topics in which the outcome is still in play, I believe. The conference organizers asked me to address the issue of global and local, and at this general level, there are intriguing analogs with earlier developments. These include the displacement of production, whether once upon a time grain, or more recently and today manufacturers, from once independent proprietors to remote suppliers of large-scale market intermediaries. Secondly, migration by those distant peoples, less integrated into remote supply networks to the metropolises, which concentrate consumption and services. And the services are divided in the metropolises between the dignified and lofty, or the low-paid, low-status, and insecure. Third analogy, continuing battles on remote frontiers and violence at home, responding to the disequilibria of property, of markets, of religious revivals. Revivals on behalf often of harsh gods that take the sacrifice of human life in stride. These are processes of attrition that afflicted the late Roman Republic, the latter Mughal Empire, the Ottoman Middle East, and the realm of American politics today. And I propose that the generic processes we term globalization involve a particular form of geopolitical restructuring which has been common to various large-scale hierarchical international realms, that is, to empires. I've been thinking about empire, actually, myself, but for about, I think, 15 or 20 years. Well, I'm trying to write a book on this. It's not a huge book, but an essay book called Among Empires, American Ascendancy and Its Predecessors. I don't think in the long run that we will try and nurture and create an imperial project. I don't think Americans really want to pay for this. I think it takes, excuse me, a substantial amount of financial commitment. It takes a certain amount of commitment to learn our languages, to go abroad. These are big efforts, and I think we would, in fact, and I think there's also a counter trend in America which doesn't like empire. I mean, I don't think we have we don't have an ideology of empire from the beginning. I think in some senses we will probably grope our way toward multilateralism, that is toward the UN. I'm an optimist, so I have a sense that, you know, at the end of the road will be, a decade hence, will be a far more strengthened UN and NGO presence in the world, which will not diminish our power in many ways. We're at our strongest when we operate through multilateral institutions. We're at our weakest when we have to try and impose solutions unilaterally. That was we knew how to use the UN in the Cold War and other periods, and that's what I believe we should return to, and probably we will return to.
As we puzzle through the dilemmas of globalization, they present the same functional outlines over and over at each level. Societies and firms despair of meeting social costs. States and cities chip away at social investment. It would be nice if we lived in an orderly federalism where the idea of subsidiarity, this magic mantra of the European Union, really governed. And we could allocate different tasks of governance to different levels. In fact, I believe we confront the dilemmas of identity formation, of viable economic enterprises, of cultural integration, of providing life chances over and over again at all levels. The global has not dissolved or transcended the local. It presents, in effect, the same patterns and challenges all the way up, all the way down.
My name's Linda Weiss, and I'm a professor of government in the School of Economics and Political Science at the University of Sydney in Australia, where I teach political science.
My argument actually goes in a rather different direction from the one you've just heard. I am bringing the national back in. I argue that globalisation is reinforcing and in some respects augmenting the state's role in social and economic development. And this contrasts, of course, with earlier and current versions of the globalisation thesis.
I was drawn into the debate largely having to come to terms with the claims about state retreat, about the decline of state power, and about the state's dwindling policy capacities. And these claims have come in various guises, moderate and radical. And it just seemed that I find that this what I call the constraints view of globalisation, one-sided and really not an adequate picture, because it presents a very stylised view of how states are responding, and in fact it largely ignores how national authorities have been coping with adjustment pressures, and so in my most recent work in States in the Global Economy, which is a collaborative effort, my co-authors and I cover a wide range of nations and sectors to grapple with these claims that the policy capacities of the state are straitjacketed, and that institutional diversity is disappearing, and that the state's powers are being displaced to other power actors, especially to multinational institutions.
So on all fronts, the maintenance of the welfare effort, taxation and strategic promotion of trade and industry, on all these fronts the evidence seems fairly clear that states have, generally speaking, found room to move where it matters, in spite of increasing pressures on the public purse, and in spite of the new multilateral constraints on state behaviour, the ability to tax and spend and to promote trade and industrial development remains robust.
I quite deliberately targeted the argument at the developed countries, because developed countries are the main countries that are globalised, the main countries that are supposed to be dealing with adjustment pressures, that are feeling the brunt of globalisation. In the actual literature that deals with state retreat, very few people really talk about state retreat in much of the developing world, because states there are still in the process of becoming fully fledged, or developing into something that approaches a Western style state.
The commentators were told that they were there to represent regions. One of the tasks for the Institute is to get two communities in the academy that very rarely speak to each other, in fact, who often see each other with some disdain. That is the globalists, the theorists, the universalists, the hedgehogs, in a sense, who only know one thing but know it very, very well and think it's very important. So people who will push one particular theoretical perspective, or who will see one key global trend. So that's one camp. The other camp is what we might call the foxes, the ones who know a great deal. And you could actually switch the identification of the animals by slightly changing the terms. But the foxes who know a great deal about a particular region, who know all the intricacies, who know all the complexities, who know all the ambiguities of a region. And these two camps don't tend to talk to one another. And what we wanted to do is to have speakers who would give us broad, global, universal views. This is the way we're going in the 21st century. And have regionalists say, well, that might be very true, but in May of 2004 in South Africa, or in February of 2003 in China, this is what we're seeing, and this is how this is actually playing out on the ground. And it was that conversation that we wanted to promote.
Now, Linda's paper offers us, I think, a very sound critique of the idea that globalization has constrained the state to the role of a supporting actor. But in keeping with her theatrical imagery, what I'd like to do is take this on the road for just a few minutes and to see how it plays in other parts of the world, on other kinds of stages with other sorts of actors. In Latin America, we see only traces of the pattern that this paper describes. Only traces of the pattern at best. Linda uses social spending and tax levels to make the case that globalization is compatible with the enabling of the state. But if this is how we measure enabling, states in Latin America have not been enabled during the past 25 or 30 years of globalization.
From the point of view of East Asia or Northeast Asia, I see Charles Maier's paper as a continuation of the argument that has been popular for roughly 20 years about the power of globalization to undermine the state and territoriality. And it's always seemed inconsistent with the region I observe. It's true that the old prevailing models in this region, the developmental state model championed by Japan and South Korea, and the communist command economy model championed by former Soviet Union, North Korea, and to a lesser degree China, have been discredited. And in the early transition, one could have drawn the expectation that these areas were moving away from state-centered development. But I'm more inclined to say that this is what we are seeing is a transformed state function rather than a false dichotomy between globalization and territoriality. We're seeing a state that has strong resilience and ways in which the state is being reasserted
state authority, as Linda Weiss argues.
I have long thought that it would be very useful for social science theory if Europe were destroyed in a nuclear holocaust. The costs, the Europeans would bear a very high cost for this. I admit that. However, social science would reap tremendous benefits. Now, certainly the European case, as Professor Weiss described, they're managing the Titanic of the welfare state. The Titanic of the welfare state is sailing on. The iceberg is visible in the water, and nonetheless it continues to sail, and it continues to take on more passengers every year. So I think she's absolutely right about that. However, the picture in the former Soviet area, what I generally call the trash canistans, the trash canistan is a phenomenon of bad governance and corrupt states and gigantic state size and microscopic state capacity. It's not a cultural phenomenon, it's an institutional phenomenon. If you look at these areas, you have a remarkable EU process in reverse.
My sense is, that we are living through a period in which we are fundamentally have been decolonizing the world of its own empires and looking toward a couple of new ones, one of which I think is the United States, and another will be in size, some differently, obviously, but the Chinese presence will only grow stronger. And this, for all the apologists of empire, empires are great at creating order when they're functioning. They're like that Titanic before it meets the iceberg. The music on deck is wonderful. The question is, though, they're really, a lot of them hit icebergs. They have been hitting icebergs throughout the 20th century.
Can we assume that over the next 50 years, let's say, and social scientists are so good at predicting, will we see states or things we recognize as states, perhaps by their territoriality or by their sense of constitutionalness, maintaining the monopoly of the means of violence? Or will this become more, you can imagine several models, you can become a unionization of violence, that might be the most benign, a mafianization of violence, sort of international thugs, or an Al-Qaeda type of violence where really basically anyone with a beef and a little bit of technology and organization can make their point as violently as any state in history.
There's another fallacy that the state voluntarily offers legitimization to violence and to enforcement mechanisms undertaken by corporations in the name of the state. And an element which we can follow now when we discuss globalization, corporations, although at their main place where the headquarters and where the legal responsibility rests, will obey to certain rules of their host state. But the moment they operate in search of their own corporate interests, whether oil exploration, if you think about Afghanistan and Central Asia, they may employ the same enforcement mechanisms as states typically do, and even worse, the local and regional traditional actors in the system, namely states, will expect those corporations under certain circumstances to contribute to regional security and stability, and that may actually add a whole new other dimension to the discussion.
Welcome to the second session of what Alejandro Portes has reminded me again is a modestly entitled conference, State of the World. This morning we were able to figure out exactly 25% of the state of the world. We are now going to fill in the next 25% by looking at what is perhaps the oldest debate in social science, and that is the relationship between growth and inequality.
My name is Ravi Kanbur. I'm at Cornell University, and my paper is about growth, inequality, and poverty.
What I want to do today is to look at the first Millennium Development Goal, the first of 8 that have been agreed by the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, the international community generally. The first goal, and this is listed as the first goal, but there's also little doubt that it's prima inter pares, The first goal is to halve the global incidence of poverty over the 25-year period 1990 to 2015.
So the questions I want to raise are, firstly, how would you actually know whether you'd achieve that? In other words, they're sort of very narrowly defined measurement questions. How would you actually measure poverty in 1990 and 2015 and know that you'd achieve the goal? But basically accepting the object of halving the incidence of poverty, the percentage of people below the poverty line being halved. The second set of questions are, accepting that as the objective, how would you actually get there? What are the sorts of policies that you would put in place in order to arrive at that? And the third set of questions are actually questioning the objective itself, asking various questions about the objective. What exactly is it that we buy into when we say we want to halve the incidence of poverty? And one of the questions that I raise in the paper is the easiest way of actually reducing poverty is to kill off poor people. And that's an arithmetical, that's arithmetically true. But actually, we know that there's the issue of so-called excess mortality, that actually poor people die more frequently, more often than rich people. So if in fact this Millennium Development Goal was met in 2015, I would want to know how many poor people have died to help meet that goal.
There's not that much in the economics literature on why it is that quote-unquote good policies and institutions are adopted or developed. Why and how it is that good policies come to be adopted, and why and how it is that good institutions develop. Okay? So I think we're weak empirically on the relationship between policies and institutions and outcomes. We're even weaker, I would say, on how it is that actual policies and actual institutions come to be or get developed. There is, of course, the contribution of rational political choice, rational political economy literature, and I talk about that in the paper. But again, I think the literature is fairly weak here. And that's quite important, I think, for the international community, because what you want to know from an international point of view is what can you do from the outside to influence things in the country so that they do adopt good policies and good institutions, whatever they are, assuming you've got that from the first part of the literature.
I wear two hats depending on the occasion. Sometimes I wear an operational hat, which is sort of a doer, so to speak, and other times I wear an analyst's hat, a thinker. Before coming to Cornell, I spent almost a decade in the World Bank. Not in the research department. Most of my time was actually spent in the operations part of the World Bank, in the belly of the beast, so to speak. So I'm quite used to saying, enough already with the questions, let's go with the answers now, and we don't need to do things. But I think as an analyst, you have to really pose more questions than give answers, and that's my general style. When faced with an issue, I ask questions.
I am François Bourguignon. I am in the World Bank. I am the chief economist of the World Bank, and I will be talking about growth and inequality.
So let me first start by trying to reconcile the growth and inequality title with a very ambitious title of the whole conference, State of the World. When I put together State of the World on the one hand and growth and inequality on the other, I told myself that maybe growth and inequality was not enough general. And I think it is important to keep in mind that when we study growth and inequality, we really have in mind something more important, which is really the relationship between the long-run economic evolution of a society and really the way in which that evolution is generating heterogeneity across individuals. And heterogeneity may be in the economic sphere, it may be in the social sphere, it may be in the political sphere, it may be everywhere. But this is really what we have in mind. And of course, also in mind the opposite relationship, the way in which existing heterogeneity in a population of all kinds may affect the way in which the society will evolve over time on its economic side.
The question is whether growth and inequality are independent things, independent concepts. The idea of, for a long time, in the mind of many people, many policymakers, was really that these were independent concepts. And you could try to grow as much as possible without considering what was going on with inequality, with the distribution of economic resources in the country. And then at some stage, it would be possible to make sure that poor people would benefit from growth. I think that what we have learned about over the last maybe 20 years is that it does not work like this.
My view is simply that we should try to work more systematically on the channels, particular channels through which there is a connection between growth and inequality. We should work more on the patterns of growth and the way in which they affect the distribution. Ravi was referring to trade reform, for example. When the World Bank is recommending trade liberalization to a country in order to enhance growth, maybe this is fine. But we would like to know what is the impact, or what is the likely impact of this trade liberalization on the distribution. Who will be affected? Who will be gaining? Who will be losing? And are we sure if the losers are among the poor? Are we sure that we have some mechanism by which we can compensate the losers in order to, at least intertemporally, to make sure that everybody is better off?
I would like to think that the reason why I was asked to get or to take that position in the World Bank is precisely because of the work I have done before, which has always been on development, growth, poverty, inequality, and the equity aspect of development. And as far as I can see, I mean, until now, I mean, it fits more or less this expectation. In the sense that it is true that the World Bank is more inclined than it was the case before to consider equity issues and to consider that equity is really an integral part of the development agenda, and that it should be the people in the World Bank operations in the World Bank should take that into account.
I would like to, in the rest of my time, flesh out the concept of human agency, well, that is agency from below, which are often obscure in general models, applying it to a problem that is relevant to the topic at hand, namely how the poor actually cope with their situation in the absence of formal opportunities for regular employment. For it is not the case that the poor in this country simply sit still waiting for the academic debate to settle and for the correct policies issued to resolve their situation. Instead, they take matters into their own hands, seeking ways of redressing both absolute and, in many cases, relative deprivation.
It's the feeling when you are in a tunnel stuck on your way into the city from New Jersey, and the traffic doesn't move. Nobody's moving, right? And that's fine so long as nobody's moving. And then the next lane over starts to move a little bit more quickly. And as the next lane over starts to move a little more quickly through the tunnel, cars start to dodge they're not supposed to, and you get enraged, right? And so the tolerance for going slowly shifts according to the motion of other vehicles in the lanes. And he uses this as an analogy to talk about the ways in which there are shifting levels of tolerance for the phenomenon of inequality.
Everybody made their excuses why they were outsiders. In my case, I should say my day job is to be an economic theorist and work in understanding financial markets. My night job, because I was born in Brazil and because I participate frequently on the debate about Brazilian economic policy, I think a lot about Latin America, and I also teach a course on Latin American studies here at Princeton and Latin American economics. But one of the things as a Brazilian, of course, I would have to be very, very preoccupied with is the question of growth and inequality. And I've thought a lot about this issue in the context of Brazil, but also on the theoretical context, in the theoretical realm. And my own view of this problem that I believe I share with François is this. There are probably some direct connections between growth and inequality, and François discussed here some of the possible mechanisms, but most associations arise from common causes, from particular policies that affect both growth and the level of inequality in society.
Inequality and crime, I think that this is, I was very happy that Alejandro Portes raised this issue, because for some time I dreamed about showing that inequality was the most inefficient thing that we could think of, essentially because if we could be able to show that inequality is producing crime, then we would have a very good argument saying reducing inequality may be improving the situation of everybody. Unfortunately, it is not that easy.
I think the real challenge for us is how to marry the undoubted sort of deductive power, the power of the deductive machine in an economic way of thinking, with the techniques of nearby disciplines. I think that's it's not a question of, well, we're now going to abandon this and take that over, but how exactly to combine those two, and that, I guess, is what I'm struggling with in pushing this argument, this discussion forward.
This morning's panel, very appropriately in a building named, in our school named after Woodrow Wilson, we deal with what one of our panelists has called the problem from hell, in that by mutually recognizing the rights of identity groups or identity claims to establish their autonomy and to establish their own set of laws, while at the same time claiming a universality for certain human rights, we might have created a literally unsolvable constitutional and political set of problems.
I'm Amy Chua. I teach at the Yale Law School. I'm a professor of law there. And I will be talking on the relationship among markets, democracy, and ethnic conflict.
And the central thesis of my book is that, contrary to conventional wisdom, markets and democracy, at least in the form in which they're currently being promoted, and that's an important caveat, but markets and democracy may not be mutually reinforcing in the developing world. On the contrary, in many non-Western countries, markets and democracy may be on a collision course. And the reason for this has to do with a phenomenon that is absolutely pervasive outside the West, and yet almost never acknowledged, in fact, often treated as taboo or not politically correct to talk about. This is the phenomenon of what I call market-dominant minorities.
My own family is Chinese, but from the Philippines. And I was born in the United States, but my parents were born in China and then grew up in the Philippines. And the Chinese in the Philippines are an example of this market-dominant minority phenomenon that I now have written about much more broadly. And by that term, I mean ethnic minorities who, along with foreign investors, can be expected to economically dominate the poor indigenous majorities around them, at least in the near to midterm future.
So what I argue in the book is that whenever free market democracy is pursued in the presence of a market-dominant ethnic minority, the almost invariable result is backlash. Moreover, this backlash isn't just random, but typically takes one of three very predictable and determinate forms. The first kind of backlash you'll often see is a backlash against markets, targeting the market-dominant minority's wealth, for example, through confiscation. The second kind of backlash is sort of just the opposite. That is a backlash against democracy by forces favorable to the market-dominant minority. The third and most vicious form of backlash is basically majority-supported violence aimed at killing off the hated minority itself. And these three kinds of backlashes have been playing out all over the non-Western world.
On the one hand, I'm interested in developing policy proposals that grow out of this. I mean, I think that's definitely the weakest part of the book, and I openly say that. You know, it's better at diagnosis than solution. So I'm working on developing, for example, ways to have more of the poor majorities of the world having a stake in land or housing, you know, so developing certain equity instruments and lots of policy directions, but at the same time, I'm also moving in a totally different direction and starting to explore the relationship between empires, historical and present, and ethnicity. and ethnic pluralism and sort of those dynamics. And it's fun. It's kind of very closely related, but it is a different project.
So far in my comments this morning, I've focused on dynamics within nations. But in the final part of my book, I suggest by analogy that at the world level, the United States itself has come to be perceived as a kind of global market-dominant minority, wielding wildly disproportionate economic power relative to our size and numbers. Just 4% of the world's population, we are seen everywhere as the principal engine and the principal beneficiary of global capitalism. And in part, I have to stress in part again, as a result, the United States has become the object of mass, popular, again, often demagogue-fueled resentment and hatred of the same kind that's directed at so many other market-dominant minorities around the world.
I'm Samantha Power. I am a lecturer in public policy at the Kennedy School. I teach U.S. foreign policy and human rights, and I spoke today about the kind of tensions between particularism and people's desire to group with people just like them sometimes, or to people who pray like them, on the one hand, and universal human rights norms on the other. So liberty and security at odds at times, equality and liberty, self-determination and minority rights, just looking at the ways in which those principles, which are all good, often are actually in conflict.
There's a major suspicion around the issue of humanitarian intervention in the developing world. There is and this I think comes from several things. One, the abuse of the claim to universality and the abuse of the language of humanitarianism and human rights. Look, see Iraq. When states invoke humanitarianism to cover, wars especially, but policies carried out for other reasons, there is a dilution and an undermining of language that then makes it hard to apply even in serious settings. But I think secondly, and as importantly, we all know that the claim to humanitarianism carries no information. Hitler invaded the Sudetenland on humanitarian grounds, on the grounds of protecting human rights. There is no information in that claim. So we do know that, and that even I would have known before. But what's very, very interesting to see now is the way in which the fact that we have proven in the past, let's call it the West, the manifestation of the Security Council will anyway, in UN deployments and in NATO and kind of bilateral engagement, we have proven that when something is humanitarian, we're not serious. One just has to flag, of course, the danger of confusing universalization with Americanization. And one sees that, of course, in the economic context, but one even sees it in the context of nation building in both Afghanistan and Iraq, where when we talk as if, as the president said, there is one single sustainable model for human progress, ours, that is going to raise eyebrows and discredit, again, some of the very, very positive effects that some of these interventions hopefully can have in the long term in terms of human rights and human life. And final point, it could be that, maybe this is just to close on a positive note, that maybe the only good news of about the stirring of particularist passions in Iraq or any place else is that it's so unmanageable and so unwieldy, as one is finding in Iraq, that it actually leads countries like the United States, which might not be at all disposed toward international institutions, to lunge in that direction.
I'm driven day to day by usually a question, so for nearly a decade, my question was, why don't we do more about genocide? Genocide seems really bad and seems really strange that we as a country who consider ourselves people who would do something about genocide, we never do, so why is that? And so then it was just by smell, throughout the decade, figuring out how to talk to enough people and travel to enough places to where I understood that dynamic. Now I'm trying to understand something else, and why do we bring an almost policy or doctrine of forgetting to our dealings with other countries, and does that have any effects, negative or positive? And maybe starting over, it's very American, forward-looking and very optimistic and so on. So I have this question, and this will drive me
Take just a few things from my particular part of the briar patch, North Africa, the Middle East, the Arab and Muslim world, in reference to some of the things that have been raised during the course of the last day and a half. For example, in no particular order, but just because some of them are a little more recent, I thought Samantha's reference to the use of, in the Afghan, the Iranian, other perhaps Muslim constitutions, the notion that there shall be no law that contradicts Islam will present all sorts of problems. But you can see the local variation because it gets even more interesting than that. In every single Muslim culture and every Islamic legal system, there's also a proposition that effectively says that local custom trumps even the sacred law. Now, whatever else the Islamic law is going to mean in these contexts, it's going to have to mean something in terms of quote-unquote custom.
So those musings then led me to wonder whether or not there were in fact two distinct problems going on in Professor Chua's paper, one of them involving a kind of clash between what she calls markets or democracy, or one might say more basally between liberty and equality, and I'll come back to that in a moment, and a second involving relationships between the rights of individuals and the prerogatives or powers or rights of groups. And let me say something now, moving closer to my region, since I'm feeling at sea here, talking about something other than the United States, but say something about both of those with regard to the United States. For the most part, the strategy of American constitutionalism has been to treat group rights and group power and group prerogatives as derivative from individual rights and individual interests. In the area of constitutional theory that I study most often and that I focus most of my work on, this has been, in my view, a spectacular success story, and that area is religious liberty. We are, by world standards, certainly by contrast with Western Europe, an extraordinarily religious country. We are an extraordinarily religiously diverse country.
I'd like to step back and to remind us of the obvious, which is that not all ethnic politics is about violence. As a number of my colleagues today have mentioned, ethnic politics can take many, many forms, from the formation of ethnic parties that take part in normal politics, pushing for representation and shaping policy, to ethnic social movements that are lobbying, to ethnic associations that are seeking to shape basic market behavior, to ethnic groups that are seeking to make life easier, more palatable, more civic within ethnic communities. The question becomes then, when are these organizations more or less likely to engage in quote-unquote normal politics, and when are they more likely or not to move towards the kind of ethnic violence and ethnic conflict that we've talked about today?
Probably of the four panels, this is the one that I least have to introduce, as this has been a topic that has been in newspaper columns, has been discussed on television and in various seminars for the last year. Is it possible for a liberal republic to be an empire? Does imperialism represent a threat to those same liberal republican values? Is the United States currently an empire? Can we speak of an American empire? If so, what is its future? If not, what is this particular beast that we are watching?
John Ikenberry. I'm a professor at Georgetown University, and I work in the area of international relations and political economy and American foreign policy. And today I'm talking on liberalism and empire, and that's really delving into the issue of how American power is manifest today around the world. How do we think about the American moment?
What I think separates American political formation from empire are three characteristics, not that the other great empires didn't have any of this, but that it's qualitatively more a characteristic of this system. First of all, the U.S. offers to provide public goods in exchange for cooperation of other states, security provision, open markets, public goods provision. Rome built the road. So this is not to say that other empires didn't provide public goods, but it's in a qualitatively new way. Secondly, the U.S. order is infused with rules and institutions that mediate and mute exercise of power. A great deal of the business that takes place within this political formation is institutional politics. And thirdly, weaker and subordinate states have some buy-in, have some stake in this system. There's a political process that is operating within this American system creating reciprocal and interactive political activity and logic that makes it different from empire.
I have argued in books and articles that American power is most successful in the world, and the United States over the last 60 years has been the most successful country in creating order, perhaps the most successful in history, if successful order is defined in terms of physical security and wealth creation. The U.S.-sponsored order has been the most successful. Why is that? Well, it's been because the U.S. has agreed to constrain and restrain itself, to embed itself in institutions, to promote mutually agreeable rules and institutions. And so my message to Washington today is that don't forget that has been the secret of America's brilliant success.
Certainly unipolarity makes it easier for the United States to walk away from agreements. It makes it easier to be unilateral. It makes it easier to say, we don't want to constrict our policy autonomy. That is true. But unipolarity does other things as well. Unlike bipolar and multipolar systems, this is a new argument I'm playing with, there are harder legitimacy problems or standards in a hierarchical unipolar order. In a bipolar and multipolar system, it's easier for secondary states to ally with a powerful state because they know that that powerful state is performing a power stabilizing function, bipolar fashion or multipolar fashion. But in a one superpower world, what gives the right of that single state to exercise force? It's a legitimacy problem.
My sense is that at the end of the day, the United States will use its power to build a world of rules, that in the end, America's self-interest is one that ties power to a system of rules and norms that create a kind of broader and deeper stability around the world, and that we are going through a transformation in the environment in which we operate, and the U.S. and its leadership and its people and its partners in other countries are going to have to engage in a fair amount of very intense reflection about how to adapt the old partnerships, the old rules to this new era, but adapt we must, and I think in the end we will.
I'm Michael Mann. I'm a professor of sociology at UCLA. I'm originally British, though I now have American citizenship as well. And at the conference, I'm talking about American empire. And my paper is an adaptation of my new book, which is called Incoherent Empire, which is a critique of the Bush administration's foreign policy.
Now, obviously, this is a very limited kind of empire if we're really comparing it to the British or the Romans. And it is only what I call a temporary territorial imperialism. Okay? You threaten countries that you deem to be rogues or evil, and if that doesn't work, you invade them, occupy them, reconstruct them, perhaps leave a few bases there, but essentially then leave it. So it's only a strictly temporary territorial imperialism, and I wouldn't like to be interpreted as saying that it aims at anything more than that. But this is a departure from the more indirect or informal empire that the US has previously run, and also from hegemony.
The US has great influence on much of the world, for example, through the global economy. The dollar is the reserve currency. The US dominates international financial institutions. And these kinds of things give the US a great deal of informal power over the world economy. But it's one not based on sending the Marines out. And that, in many ways, is the most effective form of power.
Well, why the incoherence of the title? Well, because I thought beforehand, that it wouldn't work, that it would be destroyed by its own internal incoherences. Now, in this respect, I draw very much on two ideas from my previous work which has been mainly historical and comparative and not contemporary. The first idea is that in order to exercise power in general, in order to rule over territory, one needs some combination of four different types of power: economic, ideological, military, and political. And this is my sources of social power in the 2 volumes that I've written. Now, one can go light on 1 or perhaps even 2 of these, but one needs, in order to rule, some rather broad base among economic, ideological, military, and political. And what I perceived was that the US was relying overwhelmingly on military power, and not even on all forms of military power, but on partial military power, the power of offensive devastation. So that in this respect, I think that the US lacks the powers for temporary territorial empire, and therefore is significantly less powerful than previous empires. Not because they themselves had more power, but that the rest of the world had less power then and has more power now.
The terms of engagement, as it were, was that we were supposed to take these broad macro-historical talks and try to apply them to our particular areas of study. And though I have views on many of the issues that have been raised, let me talk about the issues under discussion only in relationship to Africa. So when I saw the topics, empire, imperialism, domination, I thought I would have something to say, indeed a great deal, about these topics, because certainly Africa has known imperialism, empire, and domination for most of the 20th century, and indeed the colonial apparatus only disappeared a few years ago. What is striking to me, however, to be utterly frank, is how little traction I get in terms of understanding what is going on in Africa, or indeed in participating in African discussions between Africans, or as an interlocutor between Africans and Americans primarily, given the discussion at hand. And both papers, I would say, talk about world opinion, and I think they basically mean the chattering classes in Paris, Berlin, London, and a few other places.
There are 2 issues that I want to deal with in these brief remarks. One concerns the nature of the threat posed to the United States and to the world order, and that is at the heart of the divisions between Europe and the United States. And the other is the divergent response of the United States and of the European allies. And I think for the time being, I can still call them allies. But you will see that this is not something that is necessarily of a permanent state. At the bottom of the separation between the United States and Europe today is that the United States sees itself as fighting a war on terror. The Europeans feel that this is a danger, actually, to the way in which they have constructed their life over the last 50 years. The way in which they have constructed their life over the last 50 years has been by undermining their own sovereignty, by creating unity, by not paying that much attention to sovereignty and seeing much more strength in unity. The United States has done just the opposite, in fact.
I was wondering when Miguel was making the introductions what kind of parochialism he wanted me to represent. And Ezra has already wonderfully spoken for all of Europe. What I thought I would try to represent is actually a reflection on something in Michael's paper, but it's implied in John's presentation as well. That is that the idea of empire is a completely bogus one that shouldn't really be applied and isn't of any use at all, but it's been applied primarily by expatriate Brits, expatriate British historians who are doing a great deal of damage by making unfortunate historical allusions that unwise American politicians then take up in their Christmas cards. But I actually want to say that I think there is something real about the discussion of empire, and I think the fact that it is so widely discussed illustrates something really important. Very briefly, I think there are 2 ways in which you can conceive of the world today, and this is something that draws on what John was doing in his paper. There's one worldview that says this is a world of globalization and a world of rules and a world of agreements and a world of multilateralism. And there's another view which says that this is a world of power and of force and of empire. So you could really say that the two worldviews, a globalization worldview, as it were, on the one hand, and an imperialism view on the other hand, go alongside each other. And it seems to me that they're completely incompatible mutually. And the oddity of it is that they rather resemble those optical illusions that you know when you look at some drawn squares on a two-dimensional, pretending to be a three-dimensional surface. You can either see the squares coming towards you or you can see them going away from you, but you can't see both at the same time.
Now, we also need to be very careful about assuming we actually know what is going on, partly because the data tends to be very bad, and the models tend to be taken from inappropriate places and times. What this means is, to paraphrase both Will Rogers and our current Secretary of Defense, the problem is not what we know, the problem is not what we don't know, the problem is not even what we don't know about what we don't know. The problem is, it's what we know, but just ain't so. Pointing out the complexity of relationships or the need for better data may be the oldest academic trick in the book. I've tried it with the NSF many times. But it is a very important point to just once in a while say it may be more complicated and we could use a little bit more information. So where are we? The state of the world is not just a reality that can be measured. I would argue that it's also a set of perceptions, a form, if you will, of Verstehen, a postmodern sensitivity without all the silliness to how things look. How does inequality look? How does local look? How does empire look? And an awareness that these perceptions feed on each other and help create that reality that we're trying to work with. Now, someone in the audience mentioned earlier that physics is no longer a linear discipline and that social science and social analysis should also avoid that temptation. Similarly, I'd like to suggest that the state of the world is not linear or predictable. We have to be careful about unintended consequences, about Heisenbergian principles of observer intervention. The state of the world is complicated, and we just need to study it a lot more. Here, let me make a very parochial claim for the importance of interdisciplinarity, of problem-driven approaches. In the academy, the disciplines have become so fascinated with the shapes and the colors of their own lenses that they don't seem any longer focused on anything at hand, on any real problems, such as the state of the world. Parochially, this is what I claim the Princeton Institute for International Regional Studies is trying to do, to move us away from assassination on lenses and actually get back to the thing itself. I hope that the last 36 hours have contributed to that, and thank you very much for your patience. Thank you.